only two reasons why a boat would go rogue. One is to defect, and the other is to start a war.
I think submarine movies are such a wonderful environment to tell stories in because it's man and a machine under both literal and metaphoric pressure.
You can't escape it. You're in the sub and you're not getting out.
Somebody dive the boat or I'll shoot the captain.
This is a great story to tell from this time. World War III was just a trigger away.
It's a pretty fascinating hypothesis that, a rogue Soviet submarine could trigger the end of the world.
They'll be starting the apocalypse.
Not me. You to me. You'll be remembered as the man who turned our enemies to dust.
I grew up at a time when the Cold War was actually happening. Going to school, we had fallout shelters, and I even seem to recall a duck and cover exercise or two. But what really made manifest for me the Cold War was the fact that my dad was an architect and he was designing and building bomb shelters for other people. And I got to visit some of those places. And then later on, as I got older and started to sort of ask deeper questions about it, I started to think, well, what possible reason could any sane person have for, creating an apocalypse? And that led me to questions about, well, who would actually do that? Who would execute those sorts of orders? Eventually, it boiled down to, well, it was going to be ordinary people. It was men in silos and men in submarines and men in airplanes.
3, 2, 1, bang!
Todd Robinson, the director, and we've been buddies for quite a while. And one day he said, I've got this script I've been working on, I'd like you to take a look at. And he's my buddy, man. I said, yeah, I'll do it with you.
Todd writes in a very elegant, very complex and beautiful way about characters that he weaves into intricate technological stories. Todd flies airplanes. He doesn't just fly airplanes, he flies stunt airplanes.
Todd is a combat pilot. On his days off, as his hobby, he flies MiGs through the air in combat dogfights.
So you got to think what kind of a mind is able to make those split-second decisions, writing a story about human beings set in a very dramatic technological environment.
I had years ago gone through this submarine in Long Beach, this Russian submarine that is still there, called the Scorpion. And once I was inside, and this is probably 10 years ago, I thought, God, the texture in this place is just so amazing. It's so endoskeletal. It's almost like, you're Jonah in the whale and you're seeing all the ribs and all the stuff. But at that time, there was no way I could get a Panavision camera, even through the hatches or those sort of things. But it always stuck in my mind that this would be a wonderful set piece for a movie. We now have these wonderful digital cameras that are so small that they would allow us to actually not only get them in, but be able to move them in a way that could simulate motion in the ship.
You can, go through the hatch of a submarine with all the equipment you need. 15 years ago, it would have been a nightmare.
Todd, wouldn't I know that Demi did it?
The submarine that we actually ended up using is a actual Russian Foxtrot class attack submarine that is part of the Maritime Museum of San Diego. I kind of wanted to get my cast and crew out of town because there's something about the experience of making a film together away from home where everybody bonds in a rather unique way. And this is also a story about a crew of people. And so I really wanted to keep them together. Okay, here we go. Right away, please. I'm pretty sure that we're one of the few, if not the first, feature-length motion picture that was shot 100% in an actual submarine. So that was a lot of fun, and it's very beautiful, and it creates a sense of reality not only for the viewer, but for the actors, because everything in the submarine is hard. Everything is painful. I slam my head 3 times a day into something that could have killed me.
Foxtrot submarines held about 90-something people. We had less than that, and it was incredibly crowded. So to shoot and to maneuver in there with the equipment, sound, camera, lights, all of it, Todd had to go into it with a very planned approach with where each member of the team would situate themselves.
Excellent. Ed, can you move just a half inch to your left? Hey, Byron. Perfect.
We've learned what it feels like to be real submariners because we're under decks for hours a day.
There's not a lot of room, and everything's hard and metal and sharp. It's not like you're on a soundstage where things are made out of styrofoam or wood or whatever. You can't take out part of the wall and, shoot.
One of the challenges was how are we going to light it? Lights are big and clunky, and we're in a very, very small, tight environment. And 2 things sort of come into play here. One is the speed of the sensor, which requires very little light to get an exposure, which allows us to use lights that don't create a lot of heat and are very small.
Byron Werner, the DP, did a great job of lighting the thing in the sense that he pulled these little pin lights, you know, hidden throughout the entire sub, which I guess he had sections of them on dimmers, you know, and he could bring up and take it down. And so it saved a lot of time for one thing, and also I think really gave a lot of really interesting lighting.
I like the idea of half light. I don't like any kind of front lights. It's all backlit, very, you know, half lit.
Okay, scoot in, Byron. Keep scooting in. Keep scooting in. Keep coming. Keep coming. We could kind of relight without actually moving anything. And what I said to the actors was, you know, if you want to be in the movie, you need to find a light to stand under. Yeah, that's fine. That works.
I can see the gun.
When we first said we were going to do it, a lot of people just didn't believe it was possible. And we somehow believed in it, and what's fantastic about it is that the actors really bought into it.
I found it to be a real benefit to be shooting in such a cramped space that is obviously realistic. You know, I banged my head a few times. You kind of learn to start crouching, and that's one of the things in terms of the physicality that it gives you just to work in the real space is that you have to crouch. If you're my height, that's what you do. So I did it, you know, and it gives you a different walk. You know, you never really stand up.
It just added to the reality of it, you know, and it also, I think, really helped the cast work together.
Because we were going so hard, so fast all the time, we always had to be on. And when we did get to rise up and get out of the submarine, Ed Harris said to me one time, he knew, we started talking about baseball inside the sub. And we had a real big scene that we had to do later on the day, and he went out, grabbed 2 gloves out of the back of his truck, threw me a glove, and we started playing catch and running lines. It was a great experience.
Tráilers.
Do you think we can be redeemed for the things we've done?
Ed Harris, he's a very intense guy. He's so committed, so dedicated. He leaves room for you to project yourself into his story. And not all actors can do this. And he doesn't give you everything. And you have to work a little bit for it. The other thing about Ed is that he can do 4 or 5 things emotionally at the same time. He's surprising himself all the time. That's a guy who's willing to stand out on the wire, you know, and risk falling.
There's a scene where my character has an epileptic fit.
I'm here. I'm here.
You just have to go for it, not be worried you're going to hurt yourself, trust that those around you take care of you, and just see where it ends up. And what if you're wrong? What if their intentions are completely defensive?
Well, what if you're wrong and they're not? Well, the company's a Russian name, and my grandfather was from Kiev, my grandmother's from Poland, so I'm a quarter Russian, I guess.
Duchovny means spiritual in Russian, and David brought to this role something that he's not really explored before, which is a side of his nature where he can go deeper and darker.
Last chance, Captain.
Compliance for a grateful nation. Villains don't really know that they're villains, usually. And so I guess I made the decision that this guy is a believer. You know, he believes in his mission and in the world that he's trying to create. You know, he's a patriot in another scheme of things, you know, in another world, for another country. So if he were an American in a story about the American Revolution, he would be seen as a hero and not a villain. And that's the way he would look at himself.
David was very aware of his wardrobe, and I didn't realize what he was doing until we got into the editing room. He had made this choice to start off in sort of this frumpy-looking workman over thing, and slowly as the movie progresses, he strips down until the end of this thing, he's in this black, you know, wife-beater tee, ripped, sweating, and he's become like this kind of monster of a guy. And we didn't shoot it anywhere near in that order. But he knew where his character was in every single moment of the picture. And for a director, that you just love a guy like that. He knew exactly what he was doing. Making the submarine feel like it was moving from both the inside and the outside both took some imagination. So on the inside, we used a couple of little tricks. We used a bungee rig, which was basically a big bungee cord that we could actually hang the camera on, and you could keep tension on it, and it kind of gave you a floating sort of feeling. Then we used a thing called a Dana dolly, which is basically a skateboard rig on speed rail, and we hung rail inside so we could zip the cameras up and down the hallways.
Brace for impact! Brace for impact!
There are scenes in the movie where the ship is actually turning and pitching, and that required us to add a third element, which was choreography, because the actual submarine wasn't moving, but the camera was. So the actors had to understand if the camera was rolling this way, that they needed to move this way. Sometimes we would add visual effects, camera shake, anything we needed to create tension and a sense of reality.
Todd has turned a machine into a personal part of the story, and what that means from the audience's point of view is they sense the enormity of what it is to be inside a little pressure cooker of human beings underwater.
Forward torpedo, open doors 1 and 2.
And the next part of the exercise is how do we blend that with digital animation where we can create worlds that we can't really photograph. The environment that a submarine lives in is the water, but there are so many things working against you in that environment. You've got bubbles, you've got fluid dynamics, you've got particles, you've got light. There were just hundreds and hundreds of decisions that had to be made for every single shot. And then the other thing that is kind of wonderful about submarine movies is that it's interactive in that it insists that the audience fill in the blanks. I'm telling you that there's something going on outside the submarine, and yes, I'm going to give you peeks of it, but if I linger too long in the CGI world, it's going to take you out of the movie because it doesn't seem real, because it isn't real. That was a challenge that we wanted to embrace with very, very limited resources.
Y tus trailers, visita mi canal.
You can shoot me now, and I'll see you in hell in about 90 seconds.
This story is very loosely inspired by the story of the K-129, which was a Soviet ballistic missile submarine that left Rabachi in the winter of 1968 under somewhat curious conditions, went to sea and sank.
A research vessel from the University of Hawaii discovered a radioactive oil slick right off French frigate shoals in the Hawaiian Leeward Islands. The Navy investigated and determined that a Soviet ballistic missile submarine had sunk nearby. Not too long after that, the Soviet Navy launched an extensive search for that submarine, and what caught our intelligence force's attention was that the search was taking place 600 miles to the northeast from where the actual submarine had sunk, which told us that somebody had taken independent control of that submarine, left the patrol area, and closed it within 400 miles of Pearl Harbor. And at that point, the submarine surfaced, proceeded to a point on the ocean, which was exactly where lines of longitude and latitude would have intersected, and it then exploded and sank. All this indicated that this submarine had gone rogue. And also, the information that we had from our satellite sensors and, of course, from the material we collected from the oil slick indicated that the explosion that sank the submarine came from an attempt to launch that missile.
You understand this is completely classified?
The only organization in the Soviet Union that was capable of taking command of a Soviet ballistic missile submarine was the KGB. And at that time, the KGB was in control of a man called Mikhail Suslov. And Suslov had been one of Stalin's right-hand men. Suslov had access to everything the KGB was collecting. And as he was a genius, he was an economist, and he also realized that the Soviet Union ultimately was going to go bankrupt.
What you do not understand, and what our politicians don't want to accept or face, is that the Americans have acquired a first-strike nuclear capability.
When the Soviets developed the first nuclear weapons, the Eisenhower administration adopted what was called a first-strike scenario. And this policy was that if we had credible information that the Soviets were going to launch a nuclear attack, we would attack them first in an attempt to take out their strategic forces and minimize any loss to the United States. Well, probably before the ink was dry on Eisenhower's signature on that document, the KGB probably had a copy. And they looked at it, and to them it was, well, they'll strike us first when they can, because they didn't trust us.
What makes you think they'd use it?
We would.
They were very paranoid, and in 1968, we had actually come very, very close to achieving first strike capability.
Americans will think it was the Chinese that fired on it.
The whole idea of the KGB was to start a war between the United States and the People's Republic of China, the two enemies of the Soviet Union in 1968. Everything they did mimicked the procedure that would have been used by a Chinese Gulf-class submarine. The Chinese had two of these submarines. When the K-129 closed within 400 miles of Pearl Harbor, that was the missile range for a Chinese missile. A Russian missile could have been fired 800 miles away.
Surface the ship.
They surfaced. Russians had the capability of firing submerged, which is a stealthier way of doing it, but the Chinese didn't. Now, our military forces, our intelligence forces, constantly monitor the Soviet military. So here we would have had a thermonuclear explosion over Pearl Harbor that would have left the entire state uninhabitable for 100 years. Millions of people would be dead. First thing we would have done is looked at the Soviet Union. Who did this? And the Soviet military would just have been in a normal state of readiness. I mean, no ships going to sea, no aircrafts, bombers taken to the air, no army units on the move, and most importantly, none of the political leaders heading for the underground bunkers. However, we had no intelligence inside China whatsoever. We didn't know whose finger was on the button. It's the perfect scenario.
The bully's trying to start the only kind of nuclear war we can win. One we're not in.
Later, when an American intelligence submarine called the Halibut discovered the ship, they took, I think, over 2,000 photographs of it on the bottom. And there were curious elements found. One was that one of the missile tubes had seemed to have exploded in the tube itself.
Drop your weapons.
There's some evidence that the crew may have sabotaged it. A number of bodies were found in the forward torpedo room. Many more bodies than would normally be in there for any operation.
Activate the warhead.
If somebody tried to launch a Soviet missile by using the wrong codes, they actually detonated a small segment of the conventional explosives in the warhead, blowing the warhead apart. This also caused the missile to explode. And this is what sank the K-129. I remember interviewing a Soviet sub-captain, and I asked him, I said, this seems a little extreme. And he said, Ken, he says, it's not that we were worried about them launching a missile at you. They were actually worried about a submarine crew going rogue and trying to overthrow the Soviet government.
You'll be starting the apocalypse.
These men who were willing to give their lives for this country, they understood that this was an act that was not authorized by their government. And I think they also understood that starting a war with the United States would probably mean the death of their families. And, you know, I think the world probably owes them a debt of gratitude. I think they were probably the men that stopped World War III and allowed us to get past this.